I'm Jeff Helsing. I'm the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project at the Carter School. And I'd like to welcome you to this session. I assume over the next few minutes, we're going to have a number of additional people joining us. So I'm going to take this time just to take care of a little bit of housekeeping as well as do the introductions. First of all, the way in which we are setting this up, this session, we will hold questions and contributions from the audience until the end. That way, if there are anything you want to raise, you can do so in the chat, but but everybody will be muted until we finish with all the various presentations. So a couple of things that I want to do is I see a few familiar faces or familiar names. And I know a number of you have been able to join additional sessions that we've been hosting at the Carter School this week for our Peace Week, which we do once a semester. And we do this in September around the timing of the International Day of Peace, as well as the convening of the UN General Assembly, which is going on up in New York. But this is a way for the Carter School and people interested in peace and conflict issues to come together and explore different ideas around peace and conflict issues, and to share new, innovative, or reflective thoughts based on our experiences in peace and conflict related areas. So that's sort of, this has become a biannual event, and we've been able to continue to bring together people around what we think are often cutting edge issues, or help people get a way to amplify some of the work that they're doing. And so this is often a mix of faculty, students, alumni, other practitioners, friends of the school, and people that we think have really interesting contributions to make. The other thing I'll mention is that you may not be aware of it, but that this is actually the 50th anniversary of the founding of George Mason University. And the school itself, or the university itself, is doing a lot this year to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And one of the crowning achievements of the school, at least in our opinion, is the establishment of one of the premier schools focused on conflict resolution and peace building, and that is the Carter School. And a number of us have seen it grow from an institute to this independent school, one of the few around the world. So with that, let's jump into our session. And what we're trying to do this morning is we want to find a way to strengthen how we connect with each other around peace and conflict related topics. In a lot of our work, we are often, in some cases, talking past each other. And often that has to do with we use different language, we use different terminology, we use different lenses through which we look at conflicts, or we look at problems. And so even though there may be similar problems, we're using different approaches or different terminology. So how can we most effectively share space, work in conflict affected societies? How can we strengthen what different approaches or different organizations or different individuals may be able to bring to a particular conflict. So we're all for collaboration in theory, but how does that work in practice, or how has it not worked in practice? And our three panelists have worked on and thought about these questions in their own areas, in their own work over the years. And in each of their cases, they've really thought a lot about this question, this topic. So how do we work in multilateral space, whether engaged in civil military cooperation or applying learning from a global context to a local context and vice versa? How do we get people to embrace intersectionality and not just sort of stay focused in looking at a problem through our own lens? So ultimately, the question is, how can those of us working in a conflict-affected arena connect more effectively? And in order to help us explore that, we have, I think, three great panelists. The first to start off will be Stanislava Mladenova. And Stani is a global fellow in the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She is also on the verge of defending her doctoral dissertation in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Her dissertation is a study of civil-military relationships in fragile and low-intensity conflicts. But she's also been a practitioner, and she has over 15 years of experience working as a program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, working at the Atlantic Council, and also working as a political advisor for NATO, both in Afghanistan and also in Brussels. Stani will be followed by Ann Phillips, who is now, to our great delight, a fellow with the Center for Peacemaking Practice here in the Carter School. And in particular, Ann is focused on developments in the Russia-Ukraine war and its impact, particularly on the South Caucasus, and approaches to peace in the South Caucasus areas. For a number of years, Ann was a senior advisor for inclusive peace processes and also the Nagorno-Karabakh project at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to that, Ann developed and directed the Program for Security, Stability, Transition, and Reconstruction at the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Germany. And prior to that, she was a senior political economist in the Policy and Program Coordination Bureau at USAID. So part of what Ann brings to this is sort of bridging the work both in the civilian sector and the government sector. She's also worked at the Department of State as a senior policy analyst, and she has been an academic, having taught at both American University and Smith College. And finally, Chip Hauss, who was also connected to the Carter School as a visiting scholar, and he is a senior fellow for innovation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding and was a longtime member of the Alliance's board of directors. Chip has spent 5 decades focusing on large scale and political change through nonviolent means, through cooperation. He's what I would call a bridge builder. He's a facilitator. He is a connector. He is one of the really great networkers in our field. And he's a longtime author, and he's thought a lot about these issues. And he himself has, been the last few years, transitioned to thinking about local conflict issues. He continues to work on bringing people together, sometimes, in his words, strange political bedfellows, to help solve problems that can be effectively addressed by working together in collaboration. He is currently, he's written a lot on conflict resolution and peace building, and is currently focused on a new book which explores mostly young activists are doing to bridge ideological and issue-based divides in the United States. So I think you'll agree we have a really great panel, and I think they will be able to contribute some very interesting thoughts and ideas to stimulate our own conversation. So with that, we'll start with Stani.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Thanks to our audience for being here with us today, students, practitioners, and everyone else. And thanks to my co-panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. Considering I am the first one to go, what I wanted to do is take an opportunity and sort of do a lay of the land for a moment before we start tackling some of these bigger questions. Of course, our panel is on, how are these actors talking past each other, as you mentioned, Jeff? Or is it a different lexicon that they're using? Is it a different understanding of each other, and so forth? Or is actually the talking past each other a symptom of something more fundamental going on? Has something changed? Is something different? And that's what I would like to touch upon today, and sort of take us into multiple directions to understand some of the space before we dig into the deeper questions. So I will be speaking primarily about the US military and civic actors on the ground, predominantly NGOs. This has been the focus of much of my work and much of my research, as you mentioned. So what's going on? What's happening? What's the most recent thing that we need to be sort of thinking about and tackling? Has conflict changed? And I would say that there are probably three fundamental things that are going on today that we certainly we're observing more of. First and foremost is that, as we all know, certainly on the side of the US military, with the global war on terrorism since 2001 and the major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US military found itself in sort of non-traditional roles of humanitarian and development actors. And we most predominantly think about those two big engagements, which of course now are predominantly over. But actually what's happening is that the US military does have a soft power arm that it uses as a humanitarian and development actor. It has a whole budget line that allows it to do that, and it continues to engage in these spaces repeatedly wherever it has presence. So, and it's not just in terms of counterinsurgency, which is what we know to be sort of Iraq and Afghanistan as the two main engagements, but it does it across the gamut in all of its mandates, whether it be peacekeeping, disaster response, complex emergencies, training of other militaries, counterterrorism missions, counter-narcotics. Wherever there's a touch point in any area of operation, it can actually perform this role. The other thing that has been happening on the civilian side is that in the last couple of decades, NGOs have also dramatically shifted their own work. They've now scaled up their presence and programming in fragile states. Essentially, donors are implementing in spaces which were once off limits to traditional development programming. Before, some of these areas were too insecure, too uncertain, too fragile. But now, of course, as we focus on the ever-expanding fragility space, there's more programming. So as a result, this touch point is occurring even more. The third thing that's happening is from a sort of length and life cycle point of view. What do I mean by that? What is traditional humanitarian development and security assistance as time-bound and specific to certain contexts and conditions has also changed. And there's been a spillover between short-term humanitarian assistance and long-term development aid programming. So you could have an NGO that's providing basic humanitarian services, such as medical care, but actually could also be running a hospital in the long term, essentially replacing the role of a government service on the ground. The spillover has happened yet on one more thing I'm adding on to the complexity of the space here, which is that conflict has essentially lost its linearity. What do I mean by that? It used to be that if conflict prevention failed in one space, then we moved on to various means of peacekeeping. Once there was an agreement, to pursue a solution, then traditional methods of peacekeeping, again, very much for this crowd, could be applied. And once you reached peace, you went into reconstruction and development. These things are now occurring simultaneously. This tidy sequence of how things used to take order have essentially disappeared. And this audience would appreciate a famous work by General Krulak called the Three-Block War, meaning that certainly on the military side, you could be in a neighborhood like any one of us have experienced, where you are on one side of the block, you are fighting, on the next one, you are providing for humanitarian needs. And yet again, on another side, you're patrolling the needs, or you're patrolling the security, ensuring that crime is not taking place at the local market, for example. So very mixed, very complex. What else is further complicating this space that we are talking past each other in? I think it's important to mention the fundamentally different DNA of these entities, certainly between the military and certainly between the NGO sides. And since I recently finished a big research project looking into this, I wanted to kind of understand and almost simplify some of the categories in which both of these fall. They're both entities, they both have various accountability measures, various institutional constraints. What is it about them that's different, that maybe can help us understand why they're talking past each other? And I would break this down into sort of several categories. Again, some of them quite obvious, some of them I spent a lot of time thinking about in the last few years. But the first, of course, is the objectives. The military, clearly, very strong security objective. This is their bread and butter. This is their mission. Anything non-traditional, these humanitarian and development things that I mentioned, as almost a secondary, almost as a way to do using humanitarian and development engagements as a way to conduct security. Again, this is the big thing that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the NGO side, of course, the objectives being development, humanitarian assistance. Is it development, economic, long-term alleviation out of poverty, or is it humanitarian where you're meeting basic needs? Again, they very much overlap. The constraints around which these entities work are also different. What do I mean by that? On the military side, of course, as an outside actor, certainly on the part of the DoD, they may or may not be a wanted actor in the space. So there might be experience of hostility by the local population. Whereas with an NGO side, for the most part, I know there's quite a bit of uneasiness in the space too, even on the development implementation side. But for the most part, you could generally say that there's a general acceptance of the population. People are not going to say no to medical care or education services or infrastructure and so on. On the military side, potentially full access to any space, sometimes much easier than others, sometimes by force, sometimes not. On the NGO side, some limited access. For the most part, I would say full access. Where there's lack of access, it's not because, it could be because of the security situation, but sometimes it may just be that there's just no ability to get to a place. Again, we're talking about fragile spaces. Maybe there's no road. Maybe the only way to get to a place is by helicopter. A small NGO of 10 people is unlikely to have a helicopter at its fingertips to get to wherever it needs to be. For the military, again, the other constraint is its predominant interlocutor, certainly when it comes to training other militaries, is the host nation military. For the NGO side, donors and its donors and the host nation government. Again, very disparate, but very much civic predominant constraint. The modalities of the field operation of these entities is also very interesting to compare. Again, the obvious ones, the military I've mentioned the soft power, sort of the civil affairs side, and the things that they do, but predominantly the lethal and hard power is their bread and butter. Of course, non-lethal soft power is what the NGOs have in this space. The military, partial, non-neutral. On the NGO side, sometimes impartial and neutral. Again, this is a very interesting topic on how NGOs really subscribe to the values of humanitarianism. Modalities of field operation for the military, very short term, very reactive. They would parachute in, they would parachute out. It's kind of a touch point. Can you be a development humanitarian actor when you're just parachuting in and out? Again, a big question that I've been exploring over the last few years. For the NGOs, much broader scope, much longer term presence, depending upon, some of them might have shorter term engagements, but for the most part, a good, certainly on the local NGO side, a good guess is always that there's a much stronger sense of permanence. Their organizational characteristics, something which very much fascinated me. And again, I split them as opposites. At another time, another panel, there's also a lot of similarities between these. But for the most part, they really split themselves into, the military being, highly specialized, though they can be generalists depending upon the mission and the nature of the threat. Quite hierarchical, very up and down, quite autonomous. They can have relationships with multiple actors. One of the things which I developed or dug into the research a little bit deeper was that they actually are very open to having relationships with all sorts of actors. Question is, do all these actors want to have relationships with them? Another very, very interesting phenomenon. And again, vertical accountability, it's very stringent, very hierarchical, and they don't need to adapt to receive resources. The military is publicly funded, unlike NGOs who are not always publicly funded. They receive public money, but they have various modalities to fund themselves. NGOs, on the other hand, very multi-sector. As I mentioned before, this overlap between humanitarian and development has actually led them to have to diversify their portfolios in these fragile spaces, which are so multidimensional. Again, relationships with fewer actors, probably actors like themselves, though there's competition for funding and resources. That's a whole other topic as well. And they can also be quite entrepreneurial. They need to find funding for themselves. They need to find ways to run their programming, and they do need to adapt in order to prove to the donors that they're the best implementing partner on the ground. There's also a series of programmatic characteristics. And what do I mean by that? That these entities in and of themselves kind of belong to their own tribes. On the military side, you have what I would argue is a reinforced organizational hub. Be it the conventional force, be it special operations, be it you have different services. There is definitely diversity within the US military, but still at the end of the day, they belong to one organization. So in this context, I looked heavily at civil affairs and how they engage with NGOs. Fort Bragg is their hub. If you're the Marines doing expeditionary stuff, 29 Palms could be your hub, or Hawaii could be your hub. So naturally, these entities sort of have a organizational sort of mothership, if you will. And again, depending upon the footprint, they can be very small scale. This is the special operations forces work I looked at, but they can also be very large and conventional scale. Little monitoring and evaluation along the way. There certainly is a big lessons learned. The DoD does very well, but sort of course correction, M&E as a science as we know it on the NGO side is just something that exists under a very different context and very different understanding on the military side. To flip all of that on the NGOs, no organizational hub. You could argue that the donor is the organizational hub because everybody sort of, is accountable to them and flocks to them. You certainly have big NGOs that have, a Geneva office and then a Nairobi office and then the field offices and so on. So these are the hubs in and of themselves. but they still continue to be disparate. You could have another medical NGO with a much smaller size that's actually doing the same thing, and they're not accountable to each other, certainly not in the sense of an organizational accountability. Significant monitoring and evaluation activities. As I said, MENL has become a science. It's a thing now. You can't do programming unless you're actually monitoring and evaluating. It's a requirement. Not so much the case on the other side necessarily. Communicating with other actors, I would say, is the other sort of DNA split up of these two. And again, for DoD, highly classified, restricted environments, very much when it comes to planning, it's all about assessing the threat, understanding, holding on to information, strongly holding on to information, sometimes even information that does not have to be classified. That I have argued in some of my research is that it kind of creates a brokenness in communication with civic actors. But again, the moment someone touches a piece of information, the moment an operator touches a piece of information, it now has to go kind of behind the wall. There's some consultation with populations on the military front. Again, this is all about them meeting their security objective and understanding the operating environment. It's very much about, how can we, what is it about the civic environment that we need to know to do our work, not what do we need to do to adapt ourselves to it. There is some of that as well. There's been some great things coming out on DoD stepping up on protection of civilians. This is sort of the closest, most recent thing that's come out. But for the most part, this is something that can be a challenge for the military as well. On the NGO side, very open, depending upon the context. The information classification, if you will, is more about helping NGOs be competitive, give them an edge when they have to compete for money, when they have to compete sort of for interests. So it's less about classifying information because of a threat, but it's more about ensuring that you have the qualities as a potential implementing partner and have the right information, have the access to the space and the population, and you're worthy of the donor's attention, if you will. NGOs, strong ability to have consultation with populations. There's a lot of opinions on how well that happens. A great publication, many of us have talked about, Time to Listen, listening on the receiving end of the people who are on the receiving end of humanitarian assistance. A wonderful publication talking to 6,000 people around the world, highly recommended. It gets at the crux of much of this work. And again, this goes with assessing local needs. NGOs need to assess local needs to have an entry point for their programmatic requirements. The military, less so. What's the entry point in order to do things from a security perspective, not from a development or humanitarian perspective? And finally,
Stani, we have about 2 minutes.
Thank you. Perfect, because I have exactly 1 minute worth of things to say, which is from an adaptability standpoint, the military, I would say, highly adaptable, responsive to conditions because of their ability to navigate from a security standpoint. The NGOs, depending upon who they are, international or local, could be less adaptable to changing outcomes, meaning that they don't have the hard power ability to maneuver themselves as quickly and as in an agile way as the military would. So what does all of this mean for us, for our discussion between all of these DNA strands, if you will, of the two entities, between the changing conflicts, between this fragile space expanding and actors coming closer together to it through a series of sort of pull factors? These entities are continued to sort of do the work that they do themselves the way they sort of used to know it, the way we all used to know it. And the adaptability piece is something which sometimes can be in conflict with the prism through which they see their work. For development, it's poverty for humanitarian, it's short-term needs for DoD, it's security. And as conflict is changing, the prisms of these organizations is also needing to change, but this is where we're struggling with it. So I will leave it right there, sort of as a half point, and turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you, Stani. That's a great start for us. And with that, we'll turn to Anne to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. And Jeff, thank you for putting the panel together, I think, and to the panelists and all the participants. Look forward to the discussion. This is certainly a timely discussion because of the challenges facing peace builders has, in my view, have never been greater. They've always been there, but they've never been greater. A common thread in the UNGA meetings this week, if you've been following them, is a question: is the UN fit for purpose? That's a fair question, I think, for scholars and practitioners in the field of peace and conflict resolution. Are our approaches fit for purpose? And Jeff has identified this key element of strengthening connections, communications for all the external actors who are working in the field, which we know has been and continues to be a challenge for the reasons that Stani laid out so eloquently, and additional ones. So I want to explore this fundamental question. I want to look at 3 intersecting levels. So I'm going to step back, hone in, and then even zero in a little bit further. The first level, the international environment. The second, the assistance provider challenges, which we have talked about already, and I'll have a little bit different take on that, a complementary take on that. And then finally, the host country or the host region. So first, the current international environment was described as a time of great peril by the UN Secretary General Guterres at the opening of the UNGA meeting. We just need to pay attention to the news, and we know this is true. The global community is challenged by multiple crises: food insecurity, energy, financial crises, the climate crisis, the mother of all crises, pandemics, the growing number of wars and recurring conflicts. Together and separately, they present harsh challenges to stabilization, peace and conflict resolution, post-conflict and counterterrorism scholars and practitioners. The relative predictability, and I underscore relative, of the multilateral order is unraveling. We know this, and giving way to fragmentation and multipolarity, the remilitarization of foreign policy, the declining efficacy of diplomacy. We see this not only in the Ukraine war, but look at the South Caucasus, look at Ethiopia, and the examples go on. Rising powers are challenging the parameters of international arrangements, while declining powers cling to dominance. The result is growing instability, uncertainty, and violent conflict. A common historical pattern if we look back hundreds of years. And the impact is captured in a new multilateralism index, which was previewed at UNGA this week, which measured declines in peace and security, human rights, environment, and trade from 2010 to 2020. These declines parallel rising nationalism and authoritarianism. Not a very encouraging picture. So the second level, so that just broad framing, and that affects our work in peace and conflict resolution in these fraught spaces. The second level, the assistance providers. The lack of coherence among institutions in the same government, as well as NGOs, working in the same conflict-affected and fragile states is not a new problem. It's a well-known weakness. I've got the gray hair. I've been working in this for several decades, so I know this is a well-known problem. And it's not only in the US, because I worked with many colleagues in Europe and Japan, in Canada, et cetera, and it's a common challenge for all of us. The US government has undertaken several efforts to overcome it. It's well recognized. After 9/11, an interagency coordinator for stabilization and reconstruction was established at the Department of State, since renamed and repositioned as the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. It includes not only state, but USAID personnel, Department of Justice personnel, US Joint Forces Command, Army Corps of Engineers, and others rotate in and out. An Office of Military Affairs was established at USAID when I worked there. It's since been renamed Office of Civilian Military Cooperation, but the purpose was largely the same, a recognition that in these difficult environments, USAID personnel and DoD would be working in the same spaces and they needed to better understand each other. Again, our European partners and others have undertaken similar efforts. So some examples of the whole of government approach, which we've called the whole of government approach in the field, which many of you I'm sure are aware of, some of you may have worked on. The Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership was a DoD state USAID effort in the field. The provincial reconstruction teams, which Stani and I know well, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, modeled on cords. So some of you may remember cords from Vietnam in the 1960s, but less robust on the civilian side, I would say. And again, in this case, not just the US government, but also our partners in the field in Afghanistan and Iraq also used that model of provincial reconstruction teams. So how have these, let's say, have these institutional efforts improved coherence? Well, candidly speaking, let's put it, not as much as we had hoped, or one would hope. In the TSCTP, state aid and DoD were to do a common conflict assessment from which a coherent assistance program should develop. Well, they actually couldn't agree on a common conflict assessment for many of the reasons that Stani pointed out in her remarks. So they did produce something, of course, but it was quite generic. And so then the substance of our assistance in that region was, let's say, fell short. And if we look at the region today, we can see it's not in very good shape. PRTs, their effectiveness in a given region, I presume everybody knows the PRTs and know basically what they were about, varied greatly, sometimes in large part based on personality. Who was working in the PRTs? How did they get along? Had nothing to do with other things. But this was compounded by the fact of competing objectives, different timelines, funding streams, which we could go into more later. And another very important factor, which I think we need to take very seriously, and I don't have an answer on how to deal with it. I mean, I have an answer, but I know it won't work. It probably won't work. And that is the rotation of personnel. The more difficult a situation, hardship posed and so on, the more quickly people rotate in and out, civilians as well as military. And so this creates huge problems for continuity, if you will. And every person who joins the team wants to put his or her imprint on what they're doing for professional reasons, et cetera. This creates problems for our effectiveness, and just imagine the problems, and it's been well documented, that it creates for the host country. People come and go all the time. And so the host country feels they need to educate the people coming in, and this presents a huge burden on the host country. So the implementation in these two examples, I mean, the PRTs and the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, it's important to say, it's important to assess them. And certainly if you followed Afghanistan and Iraq, you're familiar with reports of Sigir and Sigar. And there's a lot of good evidence, a lot of good empirical work done there. But we need to dig a little bit deeper. Why is this the case? And Stani mentioned this to a degree, and I just want to hit harder on it. In addition to different missions and different institutional cultures, if you will, that's important too. There is no institutional or professional reward for cooperating well with other agencies. Agencies within the same government compete for funding. Performance evaluations do not prioritize collaboration with other agencies. agency personnel do not regularly work together. They don't do, they're not in the habit of doing conflict assessments together, of developing strategies together, of doing exercises, tabletop exercises together. We tried to do this at USIP in the CIVMIL relations program. But there was often little follow-up. So people in the different agencies do not have the habit of consulting, of working together, of listening to each other, and so on. And so you're thrown into a very fraught environment. You have the problems. I mean, the problems are even more removed at headquarters in DC. In the fraught environment, people recognize, whoa, we really need to work together, but we're coming at it too late. It's too short term. And then the rotation of personnel. So we have that. And if we are able to improve communication and cooperation among the interagency who are sharing the same space, which would be a huge accomplishment. In my view, I would suggest that the most important part of the equation is still missing. And that's the third level, the host country, which should be in the lead. Assistance providers should be in a supporting role. And if to do that effectively, that requires deep local knowledge, the ability to listen. Stani highlighted that important report that came out in 2012, I think. Local partners who are credible in the host country. And that we always have local partners. Whether they're credible in the host country society is often a very different matter. The Marshall Plan, going back in history, for the stabilization and reconstruction of Europe after World War II, is a successful model of this. A more recent attempt, and one that I applauded, I can tell you personally, the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which was signed by virtually all donors, including the UN, including China, including the US and everybody else, 19 fragile states, in 2011 in Busan, South Korea, following 8 years of intensive discussions within the OECD. The purpose was to usher in a paradigm shift in donor fragile state relations to improve the potential, and I underscore potential, for durable peace. So the principles were host country-led transitions, donor assistance harnessed to host country priorities. Donors strengthen local systems instead of setting up parallel structures. Funds to go through host country financial institutions. Budget support preferred. These were not blank checks. It was with donor oversight and the principle of mutual accountability. Donors to host country to donors was an underwriting principle. Now, there's a whole process there, which I won't go through because time won't allow it. But so there was an effort to implement the New Deal, that it wouldn't just remain on paper. There were 7 pilot countries, actually an 8th was added, paired with lead donors in an experiment from 2012 to 2015. The results, only 2 of the 8 pilots were relatively successful: Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste. So then one has to ask, so why so little progress? Well, obviously many factors: changing environment, a lot of other things, a short timeline. 2012 to 2015 is a very short period of time. But another factor that was critically important in my view is that donors, although they all signed on, didn't really change the way they engaged. They didn't really live up to the principles of the host country. And I did an in-depth report on Liberia, where the US and Sweden were co-leads for the donors. Anyway, so, and I would just go back to these things ebb and flow over the decades, ebb and flow. Stani mentioned already the Time to Listen report. And I think that came out a year after the New Deal was adopted, adopted by all the donors and so on. So to me, I say This reflected a concerted effort, albeit for a short time, to place the host countries in the center, at the centerpiece of our efforts. That would have the benefit, if we actually did this, of lashing up the interagency work to a common set of priorities. They would be those of the host country. It's a possibility. Well, in conclusion, and I'm already at my conclusion, I could talk a lot more about all these things, but I won't. The fleeting, I won't at this moment. If there's interest, happy to do that. The fleeting vision of a world at peace at the end of the Cold War is gone. Assumptions about shared values and institutions that shaped that moment are challenged on many fronts. We need to think and adjust accordingly. I would suggest let's begin at home by prioritizing, once again, country and regional expertise, which has been sidelined in favor of functional expertise, and by reshaping our own institutions to allow us to support host country priorities through a process of mutual accountability, rather than trying to create and shape host country institutions to match our preferences. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That greatly helps us kind of expand our thinking about this. And I really appreciate your sort of diving back into the past and helping us bring everything forward. We'll now turn to Chip. And I'm delighted to have Chip join us because he's wrestled with a lot of the international issues over the years, but he is now focused a lot more on what's happening in the US. And oftentimes in a lot of the work in peace and conflict resolution internationally, we've tended to sort of overlook lessons from and connections with the domestic context as well. So I'm delighted that Chip can join us to bring an additional perspective into this question. So thank you, Chip.
So I'd like to do one more piece of housekeeping. If you don't have this on speaker view, you will miss a couple of visual props I'm going to get to in a few seconds, in a couple of minutes. My presentation is a classic bad news, good news story. The bad news is that when Jeff asked me to do this, it wasn't clear how I fit into this session. It's still not clear how I fit into it. And the good news is that I will get to the question of talking past, but it will take a while for me to get there, probably about 4 or 5 minutes. Jeff's right that I have shifted my attention almost exclusively to internal US domestic politics, and some of the people I'm working with are actually in the room this morning. And it all started when at AFP, we decided we really had to work inside the US. And we had a meeting at Search for Common Ground's old office, and Baltimore came up because a childhood friend of mine who had retired for inexplicable reasons from Hawaii to Baltimore was in the room. And I said something like, how can I help tell people in Burundi or Botswana or Bulgaria that I can help them solve their problems if I can't solve my own problems in Baltimore? And you can take any country beginning with any letter and find an equivalent American city that works. And that was in about 2017, 2018. And in the last few years, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been working on something that I'm calling connecting the dots. And so I put in the chat my contact information plus a link to that blog post, Substack that I do. And there's also a link to a list of all the organizations that I'll be mentioning. And in the last 2.5 or 3 years, I've encountered this group, as Jeff said, mostly young activists, though Elias is here and he doesn't quite qualify as young, nor do I, but activists who have 4 characteristics. First, they want to find, as Anne said, a paradigm shift, sweeping change. Second, they feel the need to be intersectional. They're not all of them use that word, but they understand that we can't solve one problem unless we solve them all, if we can solve any of them. And they want to do so in an inclusive way, a point that'll be important as I go along. Third, unlike my generation of progressive activists, they are convinced that you don't have to tear the whole thing down. You can change it from within. And finally, as Jeff said at the beginning, they all have some interest in building from the bottom up. And what's happened in the last 3 years for me is that a bunch of strands in my own 55-year trajectory in this space have come to the surface. The first is what I did as an undergraduate at Oberlin, where I was in a very fortunate environment. That picture behind me is a picture of a house that I lived in my junior year, and among my housemates is Bernie Mayer, who's worked as a mediator, some of you know, Peter Woodrow, who helped write the Time to Listen report, and then wrote an even more important book called Adding Up to Peace, just before he retired as CEO of CDA. And if you live in Washington, you've undoubtedly been to Kramer Books and Afterwards, which was founded and owned until very recently by yet someone else who lived in that house. And I recently discovered that Robert Krulwich, of the co-founder and original co-host of Radiolab, is pissed off at me because we wouldn't let him live in the house because he wasn't radical enough. At the same time, in the classroom, I got exposed in my first research methods class, I am a geek, to 2 concepts: paradigm shifts and what we then call systems theory, that would now be, I would use more a term like complexity. And then when I went to grad school at Michigan, I got to work with Charles Tilly, who was arguably the most famous social change student of his generation, Bob Putnam, famous for Bowling Alone, a guy named Everett Rogers, who did the best work on how new ideas spread in a population. And I was exposed to Melvin Weber's work on wicked problems. None of this, however, came together. A lot of it, especially Tilly and Putnam, seemed incompatible until the pandemic hit. And what I realized at that point is that all these themes were coming together if, and I say if and only if, we in the peace building space, so I'm now getting to talking past each other, we in the peace building space do at least 4 things. And then I'll give you some examples. The first is we need to go where people take their conflict, which is not typically to us. It's to other activists who work on climate, race, what have you. Second, and related, we have to put ourselves in coalition with people who work on those issues. And in fact, peace building, conflict resolution per se, may be secondary to what these other folks are doing. Third, we need to understand, and this came up at a talk I was at last night, where folks from NAFCM talked to the Falls Church City Democratic Party. Yeah, it's going to take a long time. We're not going to get a solution right away. And finally, and most importantly, and I think will be somewhat annoying to the academics in the field, is that it's up to us to take the first step. If we don't, in the words of my friend Chad Ford, also a Carter School graduate, if we don't turn toward the people we disagree with, we're not going to get anywhere. So what I've been doing in the last 2.5 years of not wearing a tie is that I've been looking for and finding a whole group of young activists who share those 4 themes that I talked about before. And as Jeff said, it started out being a book, and the book may still get written, but I was convinced by Abby Rappaport, who edits a magazine called Stranger's Guide. Those are pictures by her kids behind me, that I really didn't want to write a book. I really wanted to build a movement. And so the rest of this talk is an invitation to you to join in this effort that I certainly alone will not run. And so in this book, I'm talking about 4 sets of activists who agree with all of this. The first group are ourselves, the peace builders. And I mentioned NAFCM, the National Association for Community Mediation. So last night, and this is part of something they've been doing in earnest for the last year or two, is explicitly looking at threats to American democracy. And if you're not from the United States, put your own country in there. A second group is a really interesting one that is funded in part by Rotary, and a few of you were on a call on Rotary and Peacebuilding on Monday or Tuesday. So there's an initiative called Youth and Peace in Action, which is a partnership with AFP, Rotary, the Institute for Economics and Peace, in which at this point about 100 high schools in the area that stretches from about Philadelphia into the Caribbean are developing high school-based curricula and clubs to do peace building. Each school, its teachers, parents, and local Rotary Club define a project that they'll carry out in their local community. And as of the first academic year, they had almost 200 schools in the program, though not any that I'm aware of in this area. And finally, in our own space, I've been drawn to Rotary. I joined Rotary's, my wife and I joined Rotary's E-Club for Peace, World Peace, early this year. And I've just been blown away by how committed Rotary, which is not by no means where I would have ever defined myself, is committed to especially intersectional change. But the most important things I found is that there are people in other issue areas that are really doing interesting things that we need to be engaged with, and in some cases, put them on center stage, not ourselves. So obviously in the US, we have to think about race, and I'm drawn here to the work of, in particular, Loretta Ross, who teaches at Smith College, where I didn't know Ann had taught for a while. Loretta talks, she's an activist about my age, who talks about the importance of calling in rather than calling out. How do I invite, in Ann's case, the special operations community, like Bob Jones, who's now on this call, to work with us in the peace building space? Not wait for them to come to me, but how do I ask them to join with me and do it in a way that treats them with dignity and respect? A second thing in the race world is something called the Truth and Racial Healing Transformation Community, which Jenna Kitchen, who's also on this call, has been involved with through the Mary Hoke Center at Mason and elsewhere. And again, it's an attempt that the Kellogg Foundation has funded in about 15 cities and states to bring Blacks and whites together and do so in a way that, among other things, says to white people, we need to have you involved in these discussions. Third, this is again through Rotary, there's an amazing group that Gretchen and I go to every Saturday that local Rotary clubs in Portland have decided they have to pay attention to race. And they're all like me, old white guys and women who have realized that they have to go into the community, learn about what Black and Brown and Asian American people need, and then find ways of using their own skill sets to empower them. Another area is reshaping the economy. And again, we can't solve race, we can't solve peace building unless we take on the economy. So I have been quite active, here's another prop, with an organization called Zebras Unite. They even gave me a keychain. And Zebras Unite is an attempt to build an alternative economy by emphasizing and empowering startups that are run especially by women and people of color, that are committed to a more egalitarian economy and a more just culture. And Elias Krim, who is here now, has just moved from South Bend to Washington to, among other things, help set up a Zebras Unite chapter here in DC. There's another more performative group because it hasn't figured out how to do the grassroots part that the zebras are doing, called Imperative 21, that comes out of the B Corp movement. And finally, again, it's a Rotary connection in part. I get to work with a guy named Devin Thorpe, who runs something called Superpowers for Good. And what Devin, among other things, tries to do is to create funding mechanisms, crowdfunding mechanisms for startup companies, especially those that deal with race or affect the climate. And that leads me to the final initiative. There are really cool things going on in the climate world that take us beyond the Al Gore, Greta Thunberg calling out of people who are responsible for climate change. Have to do that. But have connected with 3 groups that are doing the calling in piece of this. The first are a group of conservatives. One is a guy named Bob Inglis, who is a former congressman, Republican congressman from South Carolina, who lost a primary in 2010, I think, because he came out in favor of climate change. He now runs something called Republican with an EN, to have a sort of a capitalist approach to climate. And then there's a woman named Catherine Hayhoe, who teaches climate science at Texas Tech University, and she is also an evangelical Christian, and her husband pastors their church. So her neighbors, her students, etc., are all part of the problem. How do you reach out to them? And she does it by talking about how climate is affecting farming in West Texas. She talks about how climate is going to require the petrochemical industry to create new jobs in things like wind and solar, which are abundant in West Texas. A second group is a group called Revolve, which provides funding, think again back to my friend Devin, to nonprofits. You invest in Revolve, it then loans money to BIPOC and women-run nonprofits to put solar panels on their buildings, and then trains people working for those organizations to develop skills for working with solar. And finally, here's the easiest thing that you can possibly do. You can shift from using Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo and adopt a new search engine called Ecosia. Ecosia is about 10 years old. It's German by origin. But instead of selling your data, it takes the money it makes from advertising that exists on the Ecosia site and plants trees. And as of yesterday, Ecosia has planted upwards of 158 million trees and will probably hit 160 million by the end of this year. So, in conclusion, talking past each other and the like, it seems to me that the kinds of organizations I'm talking about will succeed if they learn to not talk past each other and develop tools in at least 4 areas. First, and this is really central for this field, and especially for the academic side of this field, we need to leave our personal and organizational egos at home. We need to realize that this is not about peace building. It is not about conflict resolution. It is not about building your own career. It's about building something that is much bigger than ourselves. Second, we need to be willing to question and broaden some of our most basic assumptions. Third, and I'll get personal here with a couple people in the room, we need to learn from the people we disagree with. Rather than treating them as the enemy and the people we need to change, we need to learn and listen from them. So I've been fortunate enough over the years to get to work a lot with military folks. And I was asked 15 years or so ago to give a keynote at the Special Operations Command on the second day of a conference. Toward the end of the first day of the conference, Bob Jones, a classic special operations officer, said everything I was planning to say the next morning. I had to change everything. And my response was not to get pissed off at Bob, but to reach out to him and figure out how we could work together, which we've done now for the better part of 15 years. I've also had the privilege of working a lot on interfaith stuff, especially with evangelicals and now members of the LDS community. And among the people I've gotten to meet there is Chad Ford, who I mentioned earlier, who's a Mormon, but also Amber Lewis, who's on this call, is a Carter School graduate and now works on economic empowerment in northern Minnesota. And finally, and this gets to the question that Ann raised, the problem that I'm having doing the work that I'm doing is there are no incentives out there for people who work in each of these silos to work with each other. They claim they want to do so. They know they have to do so. They would be delighted to do so. However, whether it's their funding or their expertise or what have you, they tend to look inward. And so I will conclude with one last visual prop. I wore a tie today, in part because the last time I wore a tie, next to the last time I wore a tie, I've worn a tie like 4 times since the pandemic began. We interviewed candidates to become executive director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I figured I should wear a tie to those. And when we interviewed Liz Hume, who ended up getting the job, not surprisingly, we asked her, how would you build the field, which was part of the mandate we on the board set. And Liz said, I wouldn't build the peacebuilding field alone. We have to do that. That's why AFP exists. But I would do it, and this is why I like Liz so much, because we need to reach out to, I would build the field by reaching out. She didn't mention any of the names I mentioned, but by reaching out to the Catherine A. Hauss and Bob Inglis's of the world. And let me end then with an invitation. I put my email in there for a reason. I am running this thing that has no real form yet other than my Substack post. And I know at age 74, I shouldn't be leading anything, but I want to be the catalyst, as Jeff said at the beginning, I'm a networker. I want to be the catalyst that brings people together. And I'll out at least one last person in this call, and that I met Naomi Euler at the discussion Monday morning with Rotary, and I've already begun working with her on how to help her make her potential projects happen. So I'm intrigued by the possibility of working with you, especially those of you I don't know yet, and I will stop.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Chip, Stani, and Ann. A lot of very rich material to consider. What I'd like to do is, if you have a question or wish to add a comment, just raise your hand in the chat area or the other area, or you can actually put a question into the chat and I will then articulate the question. One of the things that I think is really particularly interesting about all 3 of our speakers is sort of the focus on engagement and the importance of listening, and the question that Ann raised about whether the UN is fit for purpose, whether the field is fit for purpose. I mean, whether our institutions or organizations, our approaches are fit for the purpose of bringing about change or building sustainable peace, or even providing support for those who are engaged in doing so. I think all 3 emphasize the importance of looking and working at the local level and oftentimes being willing to be supportive in that role. And so how can we be more effective in doing so? So I think there were a number of really common themes. And so I guess the question I would start with is, and this was raised by Stani early on, and that is, how is the changing nature of conflict that all of you either said directly or alluded to, how should we be focused on that? What does that mean in addition to a number of the recommendations and suggestions that each of you made? In other words, is it part of what you've been saying is that we haven't been as effective as we needed to be? And given that, is the changing nature of conflict, if the fact that it's less linear, if the fact that basic institutions, democratic institutions, community space or civic space is all under threat, do we have the tools, do we have the approaches to even deal with the changing nature of conflict, much less being able to engage effectively? So let me start with that question and then see what other questions those of you might have.
Jeff, do you want us to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, if each of you have any response to that, I would appreciate it, and then we'll take other questions.
But actually, the way I would answer that question is to ask Bob Jones to say, as a special operations advisor, how the institutions that we have, including his command, are not well set for dealing with the problems that we face. And since we're not likely to get a new constitutional convention and define new institutions, we have to change the culture we use inside of those institutions, and whether that's decolonizing the Special Operations Command, as Bob has written about, or decolonizing the peacebuilding field, as, say, Severino Desser has written about, or decolonizing the progressive left, which is what I'm really talking about. I think that, you know, if I were allowed to rebuild our institutions, they wouldn't look what they do now. But that, luckily for the world, that's not going to happen. What I can do is help try to produce a culture shift, whether it's within the Carter School or AFP or the Special Operations Command. I don't know if that was helpful at all, but.
Okay, great, thank you. Stani or Ann?
I can go. I can sort of chime in on this. There's so much that has been said. I want to pick up on what you said about culture, Chip, and really to answer your question, Jeff, how should we be focusing on this? So the first thing I want to touch upon is that culture also changes. And it's a reaction to what a young generation, and I say this on the military side because yes, they are young. You need young people to be fighting wars. You need the generals to be setting strategy, but you need the young people in the field to be doing these things. There is certainly a generation that has been experiencing everything we've been talking about. So just like you had people in the 90s in the peacekeeping field sort of knowing from what had happened a couple of generations back. You now have, it's 2022. Certainly you have people that have built their careers over the course of these last 2 decades on the very things we've been talking about. So their inherent understanding of what is occurring in this space from a behavioral standpoint, from an organizational constraint standpoint, from objective standpoint, from, stay out of this space, get involved in that space, comes from their own ability to contextualize this occurrence. And if you have been experiencing a force, this is particularly true for SOF, and many within the SOF community know this, a force that has become very lethal, and had to literally mass produce and go from 30,000 to 70,000 to address the global war on terror, essentially. This is something that's going to require a culture shift, because people have gotten to literally grow up with that, or grow into their careers with that. So knowing that that is an immediate separator from the civic side, which is very much not about the lethal, I think that's a kind of a conversation starter. With that being said, I saw a point from Nick in the chat. How do these actors know how not to do harm? I'll be very transparent with you. In the research, when I interviewed, I did over 70 interviews on both sides. Many of these young operators understood this concept. They understood that even something as simple as going and distributing masks in the middle of the pandemic to a local community, killed an economic opportunity for a local woman and her children and her family to make these things out of cloth and sell them to the community. And little stuff like that that I picked up in the stories that people were sharing. There's very much a commonsensical recognition as to what that means. And to go back to your question, Jeff, how do we focus? I think we invite the opportunity to hold a mirror to each other. It's like if I were to walk into a 360-degree and see what is my behavior as an individual. Forget the organization for a second. Bureaucracies are stringent, they're hard, they take a long time to change. There's a reason why change management is a field, yet one more field in and of itself. But at the individual level, and one over which one has control on their behavior vis-a-vis their interlocutor, I think that's where it starts. And we can talk, the whole Anne mentioned it's very personality based. That is absolutely 100%. I can dig into that later on in the discussion, but it really starts with the individual, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
So I can just chime in briefly, and I'm looking at the clock. I see we don't have that much time. One, the changing nature of conflict, to me, this goes back to the importance of local ownership, but also country and regional expertise among assistance providers. We have shifted away from that in favor of functional expertise that assumes a transferability of knowledge and processes and ways to set up things that go from one country to another. Hopefully we've learned by now that is not the case. That would even be true for your work, Chip, in different parts of the United States. We are not a unified country. We are a country of collections of different cultures and practices and values in many cases. And I think of that wonderful book about American nations. Anyway, that's a different, maybe something we could talk about later. Cultural change, I like to think of culture as enduring, but not immutable. And I think we see that throughout history in different parts of the world. And that's a concept that has helped me a lot. We haven't talked about social media. Social media can be very positive, can be extremely negative in every part of the world, including within the US. And also, yeah, I saw Nick's comment as well, Stani, and I thought Robert Jones' comment on Nick's question was very good. Civil organizations, civilian organizations do enormous amounts of harm when they go into foreign countries. Just by, and my colleagues at USAID, they were they would recognize that we undermine local social capital. We undermine local ways of doing things because we don't recognize them. So there are different ways of doing harm. We certainly saw this in Afghanistan, Iraq, but we see this in all these areas. And the important piece of that is to be aware of it. And you cannot be aware of it unless your local knowledge is very deep. So we need to think about unintended consequences. And so just to underscore different ways of doing harm. And I think that's an important thing for us to always think about when we are trying to assist. Thanks.
Thanks. We really have time for one more question, and I'm going to go to what Elias put in the chat. And he asked the question, to what degree has our recent history of development been one of the obstacles to peace building? And the degree to which, in a sense, if I understand the question is, and it goes back to the question of paradigm shifts, are we the prisoner of an old and outdated paradigm? And I think, Anne, one might be able to say, based on your presentation, that, you know, the New Deal for engagement in fragile states, was it an attempt to break through that paradigm? And as you rightly pointed out, it was kind of successful with 2 of the 8 pilots. So where has that left us? I mean, do we simply revert back to these old paradigms because we haven't had successful new approaches? And I think that may be, I think that's a fundamental question as well. So I appreciate the question.
Well, just on the New Deal quickly, and we can talk about commitment to development. Since I worked at AID for 7 years, there's a whole lot to be said about that and how successful our assistance has been or not. The New Deal is basically, it kind of exists. There's still a secretariat, but it's rather moribund. And based on interviews that I did with a lot of assistance people, both USAID and Sweden, because I looked at Liberia, is that many professional assistance providers really didn't believe it would work. And so they weren't, although the government signed on, they really weren't invested in it in many ways. Because that would require such a change within how our professionals did business, and people are often reluctant to change. Commitment to development. USAID has been struggling for decades with a recipe for successful development. I mean, you can look at the literature on that. You have import substitution, export-led development, government-led development, grassroots development, still looking for a recipe. And probably that is a core problem. We're always looking for a recipe. We're looking for an equation that will work. And again, that tends to overlook the strengths and weaknesses in social capital and practices in specific locations. And there's probably some inherent challenge for institutions to be able to be agile, to have flexibility. In the case of the US government, a lot of that has to do with the Congress and how they fund things, so it's a whole chain of obstacles. Nonetheless, and let me end on a positive note, I worked at AID, State, and DOD. There are great people in all these organizations, very committed and very smart and so on. Many are very frustrated with the impediments they encounter in trying to do their work based on the institutional requirements and structures that shape what they're able to do.
I'd add directly onto that by moving away from the US and saying that, in answering Jeff's question, we're using an obsolete, I'll use a word of jargon here, reductionist paradigm that says there is a short-term answer and it can be engineered the same way you can, fix your car. If I had used slides for this, I would have included a picture of what's known as the infamous Special Operations Command Afghanistan spaghetti map,
Oh,
which I assume Bob worked on. And because I first saw it when I was visiting SOCOM. And what's remarkable about the map is you cannot make sense of it because everything is in it, everything is connected to everything else. And you have to pay attention, at which special operators in particular are attentive to the direct, indirect, and nth order impact of your actions, much more than was ever the case. Even in my case, I mean, you mentioned cords and Vietnam, which was my childhood. And what is interesting to me in working with the Special Operations Command is that because they are on the ground, they get it, whatever it means, far better than, more quickly than traditional foreign policy experts in uniform or not. And, you know, the weekend before I went to SOF, I spent the weekend with a guy named Hank Crumpton, who led the CIA special operations team that overthrew the Taliban in essence. And he sounded like an NGO guy. And then the following week, I'm at SOCOM, and Bob steals my thunder, and I call my wife, who's a retired open source intelligence analyst, and said, "This is crazy. They all sound like goddamn NGOs." And she said, "You should understand that. If they don't understand the context that they're in, they're dead." And if I'm saying anything about the US or any other places, why local peace building and the work of John Paul Lederach and others is so important, is that these things all have to emerge bottom up, which is why, say, the work that Amber is doing with Lead for America is so important, because, you know, I just don't go to Duluth where she lives. And we're going to develop a project with NAFCOM, Rotary, the Zebras in Columbia, South Carolina, because a bunch of people happen to live there. That's where the answers come from. And the special operators get that far more readily than NGO folks do. So again, it's my mantra: you listen to the people you think are different from you. And hopefully I've done this in a way that opens the door for Stani.
Yeah, yes. I wanted to leave us, you know, like at the end these days when you go to conferences, they leave you a little gift bag at the end. So since we can't do that here, I'd like to just give a couple of gift bag thoughts for our audience to take away, if I may, just to contextualize it. This conversation around the 3Ds, the security development, deployment, and so on. What I think we have in sort of the luxury of a timing now. 20 years ago, when this stuff was happening, certainly I was a young practitioner at the time, but from 20 years ago to now, this 3D compilation, if you will, many, both on the development and security side, would say that this nexus just kind of, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, just kind of happened by accident. It wasn't really thought through. As we know, no one had intended to have 120,000 soldiers in Afghanistan doing development projects, running PRTs, and so on. This kind of progressed. As we've retracted from that, and we don't have 120,000 people on the ground, but we have small teams, small missions in an increasingly expanding fragile space, in which 1 in 4 people in the world will be living by the end of this decade, so just 8 years from now. We actually have the luxury to think about these things, and to think about them in a deliberate, constructive, and utilitarian way. So we keep talking about doing things at the local level. We can start doing by listening to one another, yes, for starters. The personalities bit could not be any more emphasized. What does this mean? Like, what we get along. We have a beer together. We have a coffee. We hang out in the same office. What does this actually mean? And I would really invite our audience to, next time you are in a engagement with someone that has different opposing views than you, it doesn't have to be CivMil. It can be, it can just be the current domestic context, to really take the opportunity to listen, and to really almost kind of, take yourself out of your own body and try to put yourself into their body and think about it from their perspectives. And you don't have to go very far. I listen. I'm in New York now because I've been following the On the Side events, but just 3 hours north of here, I live in rural upstate New York, and the very understanding of the world, of the community in which I happen to be, is very different than the people walking around outside of this building at the moment. And being able to just, this is where the personality bit comes in, the ability to open yourself up and really see it through the prism of the other. I think that's really the key starting point. And to understand, I think that the most key part of the research that I have been doing, I sort of split them up into, how people fell into various groups. And there's the one group that I like to call the enlightened. The enlightened group on both sides, on the civic side and the military side, were the individuals that were willing to lean into the ambiguity of this space and understand that hands down, we don't have the answers. And it's not about giving an answer, it's about listening. And sometimes that's the answer, just hearing what the other person is saying and really understanding it in an intellectual and emotional level, because we teach a lot about empathy and sympathy. To integrate these two, because sometimes just by listening, it opens up the door for conversation. And both of these sides absolutely have the ability to do that. I'll leave it at that.
Well, we've run out of time, and I think that's a wonderful way in which we can end. I also commend a number of the points that were made in the chat, because it makes me realize that we are only just touching on a lot of this. We did not talk about justice, and I think that was certainly another critical aspect to the work of peace building that was raised. The degree to which bottom-up approaches are greatly challenged by or interfered with or prevented by the big foot of top-down approaches, I think is another area we could really usefully explore. So I'm really delighted that our three panelists did a lot to challenge our thinking, our assumptions, raised a lot of questions, and there's a lot in this area to move forward on. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Anne, Stani, and Chip, for their insights and their words. And I will leave the chat up for a few minutes if anybody wants to scroll through it, if you haven't done so, because I really appreciate the comments that have come from our participants as well. Some really very interesting additional insights. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I appreciate your participation.